Continuing on chapter 4 on socialization, we're now going to look at the three sociological perspectives and how they examine the socialization process. So, the first one that we're going to look at is symbolic interactionism. Remember, symbolic interactionism is examining the interaction between two people, examining the symbols that they share. They have to be mutually understood, and that human nature is a product of these interactions. Symbolic interactionism really challenges this idea that our personalities and the way we act is biologically based. It's that nature versus nurture debate that we talked about during chapter 3. Symbolic interactionism really believes that we are all basically born blank slates with a few genes that determine, hair color and all of that, but that our personalities, the way that we behave, is all culturally based and learned throughout the socialization process. So the two things that I want to focus on is the concept of the self-concept and the looking glass self. So what is the self-concept? The self-concept, I'm reading from your book on page 92, was developed by a man by the last name of Cooley. And he really was examining his children and seeing how they were learning and how they were being shaped. And he noticed that children interpret the reactions of others towards them. So think about whenever you've seen a child, you know how sometimes kids want attention and they don't care how they get the attention, so they may do something bad, but they're really watching us and they really want, they shape their behavior based upon others that are seeing them. So that children learn to judge themselves in relation to how they imagine others will react to them. Thus, others serve as mirrors for the development of the self. So people are developing their self-concept by imagining how others are going to react to them. So you're developing the self-concept, okay? And then taking that a little bit further, there's a concept called the looking glass self. This is where we are basing our perception of others' judgments of us. So this looking glass self is a 3-step process. First, we imagine how we appear to others. Then we imagine the reaction of others to our imagined appearance. And finally, we evaluate ourselves according to how others have judged us. So usually it's in a positive or negative way. This isn't something we consciously do. It's something that's happening very quickly. They almost happen at the same time. Think about social media and how people portray themselves. Do people usually put, the first picture that they take of themselves as their profile picture on Facebook or on Snapchat? Are they taking just one picture? Or on Instagram, are they just picking a random picture? No. Usually people really think about what they're putting out there, what status that they're sharing. They're basing it upon how others are going to react to them. So they're creating this looking glass self through their interactions. So think about how this whole process shapes the individual that we're putting out there for others. Is it our real self, or is it something that we're making, something that we're creating? We also have to remember that some people's judgments are more important than others. You may not care what some people think of the image that you're portraying, but there's certain people that hold special weight and that we care about more, so their judgments of us hold more weight. So moving on to structural functionalism, remember, functionalism is looking at different parts of society and the contributions of that part of society. You can also think about it, what functions do they provide to society? So we could look at public school systems and the mass media when we're thinking about functionalism. So there's intended things that these things do, and the intended functions are called manifest functions. You can see that at the bottom of the screen. And then there's things that are unintended, like things that kind of happen almost like an effect, They're not intended, but they're outcomes. Those are called latent functions. So if we're talking about the public school system, what does the public school system do for us? Well, it's a system where one, children get their education, and then later in life, they go to college where they are preparing for a future career and to be a productive person in society. So those are the manifest functions. That's what's intended. But there are other things that our public school system does. How about that it teaches patriotism? That's where usually kids learn how to say the Pledge of Allegiance. What about the school system as being a daycare? Many of us have been affected by that latent function. It wasn't intended, but it kind of came about. We are all able to go to work and do things because we have this system where our children are taken care of while we're at work or earning a living. So that's those manifest and latent functions. And then we could go on for examples with the mass media. Well, what is the manifest function of mass media? Remember, that's a way to get out information to the public in a very easy way that you're able to get a message. Well, that's where we learn about the news. That's where we get educated. We get information out there about what's going on in our world. But there's also unintended outcomes that happen. Who controls the media? What message is getting out there? In this most recent presidential election that happened last year in 2020, there was lots of debate about where you get your information from. And depending upon where you get that information, it really shaped your belief systems and your politics and how you're socialized. So there are some big unintended outcomes from these two parts of our society. In conflict theory, remember, conflict theory is all about examining who has power, who has access to resources, and also looking at different groups that struggle to have equality, to have equal access to resources and things in our society. So reading from the book, again on page 92, it says the conflict perspective views socialization as a way of perpetuating the status quo. When people are socialized to accept their family's social class, for example, they help to perpetuate the existing class structure. So remember when we were talking about social class and that people within a particular social class, they have similar values, they have similar income, similar belief systems, similar behaviors, and that is socialized by your family, by the school that you go to, by the people that are in your community. Well, the conflict theory really looks at that by teaching these things to future generations, that it makes it very difficult for you to go from working class level to an upper class. Because whenever you're socialized and you're around people that are similar to you, similar income, you're just used, and that's where you're comfortable, and you think that that's just the way it is. Well, conflict theory really looks at those that occupy powerful positions in our society. So it makes the charge or hypothesizes that the ruling class monopolizes the media. And by ruling class, that means people who have a lot of money. So that ruling class would be that upper elite class in our society, that they monopolize the media because they own the media. Think about CEOs and the corporations that profit from having control over what lands on our news sources that we have, and their marketing and the money that they're making off us consuming their goods and services. And that workers, think about those who are at the bottom of these big companies, they're exploited because they're being paid less than they really deserve. They're making money for the people who are at the top, and that consumers are overcharged. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you're interested, there's a lot of information in the book. There's a lot of information out on the web about U.S. corporations and how there's basically about 10 corporations, less than 10 actually, that own all of the goods that we purchase, and how it's becoming like a monopoly. And those of you that have taken an economics class or even a history class have learned how dangerous it is when we limit choice. And when you have a monopoly, consumers lose out, because not only do we lose out on having a real supply and demand with the way that things cost, but it also comes at the cost of quality as well. And not only do we have very few corporations of goods that are owned, the same thing happens with media companies. So we basically have about 6 media companies that own everything that you watch. And think about how powerful the message is. We've just, again, went through an election where it was, do you watch Fox News or do you watch NBC or CNN? And based upon where you get your news sources, really slants the information or changes the message that comes through those news corporations. Think how difficult it would be to produce a show or to portray information that went against the mission or the belief system of that corporation. And when you see that so many news channels, places where you watch TV, movies, all of that goes underneath each corporation, it really limits the information and access to differing ideas depending upon where you get your information or what services that you have. So it boils down to this idea of the ideology and the power elite. Ideology is the set of ideas used to justify and defend their interests and actions. So we have to be really careful about the power elite. These are people who are part of that upper class, who not only have a lot of money, but they also have a lot of influence and a lot of power. And when a few elite individuals control big portions of American society by ownership of goods, services, the mass media, it really not only shapes the experience that we have in our culture, what we see as important, what is focused on, and access to resources and goods within our society. And it's also shaped depending upon which social class that you're in.